You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Carl Sayat Puma Podcast. You're listening to Teka Teka News. For this year's World Tourism Day, the UN World Tourism Organization calls on groups worldwide to focus on green investments or investments in tourism that protect both the environment and local communities. Palau is a tiny nation making giant strides in these green investments. In 2017, its government began requiring tourists to sign a pledge to respect nature, becoming the first nation to change its immigration laws for environmental protection. Let's listen in to a snippet from the podcast Climate-smart Fisheries, where we sat down with two members of Ebiil Society, a nonprofit organization in Palau that works in environmental conservation and education. In this episode, we'll learn how the key to building a conservation nation stems from a deep understanding of the environment and its impact on future generations.
Palau is an archipelago in the Micronesian region in Oceania, just east of the Philippines, north of Indonesia. If you locate it on a map, the first thing you'll notice is its size, just a few tiny dots compared to adjacent countries. However, its strategic position has afforded it the richness of flora, fauna, and minerals. You see, Palau is surrounded by a large barrier reef and waters that boast of around 700 coral species. You can get a glimpse of them underwater in shades of red, pink, yellow, more. What's also fascinating is that the many islands are, in fact, ancient coral reefs lifted out of the water. What are coral reefs anyway? Let's hear from the folks at Ebiil Society, an environmental organization in Palau.
Hi, my name is Elchung Hideyos. You can call me El for short. I am 25 years old and I work at the Ebiil Society in Palau, which is a nonprofit organization that works in environmental conservation and education. And my role is doing research and data management with high school students and as well as working in the local communities.
Hi, my name is Iseko Willyander. You can call me Is for short. I'm 16 years old and I am a youth representative from Ebiil Society, and I've been participating in all the events and research programs that they've held ever since I was 8 years old.
Wow, 8 years old. That's a long time to be learning about coral reefs, is? Okay, but Elle, let's start with that. Tell us what the coral reef ecosystem looks like underwater.
I think of different colors from blue, green, yellow, from the different types of corals. Lots of movement of animals like fish, sharks, turtles. Reef fish are sort of like parrotfish as well as surgeonfish, and those that are they only eat like the corals and seagrass. And in Palau, there is very high biodiversity, so there's a lot going on in the coral reefs. The east side of Palau, I think, has smaller coral reefs, but then around the northern, west, and southern parts of Palau, it's everywhere. They're important as shelter for fish as well as food. They're animals, so they're also a living thing, as well as being able to provide food for humans and other species, not just fish. There's also nudibranchs and different slugs and snails.
So, coral reefs, just to repeat and to emphasize that, so corals are animals, not plants, not rocks. It's good that you pointed that out because a lot of people think that animals are like those that we, of course, typically see. You know, those with eyes or those that can move around. In any case, the point is that these corals deserve as much respect as the animals we are all familiar with.
Every time I go snorkeling with a bunch of people, different people, sometimes they would stand on a big boulder coral and I would say, hey, you're standing on a coral. And they're like, no, I'm standing on a rock. It's a coral, it's not a rock. So people misunderstand and assume that some corals are rocks or that they're strong enough for us to touch them.
Basically, living things that live and breathe. In fact, globally, this is where about 25% of the world's fish congregate. It's basically like an underwater city. In the city, you have supplies, houses, food, you have a lot of people. Coral reefs are the marine equivalent of cities on land. Now tell us, how significant is this resource to the people of Palau?
Okay, so coral reefs and the ocean is a source for food and for fish. And fish is like the main course of cultural gatherings, and even in the household, fish is like our main source of protein. So it's very important to us. Fishing is a very common practice in Palau, all types and all kinds of fishing. And it's sort of an activity, a leisure thing that people enjoy, but it also brings people closer because usually Palauans do community fishing for like cultural events. Like if there's a funeral, a lot of men go out and they gather and they go out to go fish, and that kind of strengthens their bonds, and they can spend time with each other.
So I know that there was a recent report on how much marine resources Palauans use, and about 70% of Palauans in Palau, they fish, not just for food, but for us income as well.
Yes, clearly. Without coral reefs, fish vanish, and obviously, this will have a detrimental effect on people's livelihood as well as food security for the entire society. But apart from this, I was wondering how coral reefs help to protect you from climate impacts.
In terms of adaptation, they protect the coastlines and coastal communities.
So it's a line of defense against, for example, even typhoons.
Yes.
To me, the coral reef is our island's protector. Since we live on small islands, it's very likely that big waves can damage our islands because of rising sea level and everything. But then with coral reefs, they break down the waves so that it's safer for us.
Coral reefs are an important resource for food and livelihood and the health of our planet. To Palau, they are integral to the culture. So when an incident like coral bleaching happens, it's a big deal. Corals get their color from microscopic algae that live on them called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae provide food for the corals, while the corals give them shelter. They depend on each other to survive. When corals turn white, that means the zooxanthellae have left. Why? Because the environment has become stressful. Either the water has become too warm, there's too much sunlight, or the water's polluted. White corals mean they are in danger of death. This is coral bleaching. Palau has experienced coral bleaching before. The worst was in 1997 to 1998 during an El Nino event. According to the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, approximately a third of Palau's corals died. It took several years before they could recover. Now imagine what would happen if the Earth's temperature continued to rise. We would have warmer oceans and more white corals. Tell us about the situation in Palau right now.
We've done surveys and we've spoken with a lot of different Palauans, and they always say that they have seen the negative effects of climate change and that they've seen coral bleaching, like coral reefs that they used to, that they knew before that were abundant and filled with life are now depleting and dying and even bleaching. So yes, there is that problem within our country.
And are there other threats that coral reef face? El?
So tying into what Iseko said about sort of the change in conservation, right now is overfishing. Another threat is sedimentation from the land with the different developments and sort of human activities that create erosion. They end up going into the coral reefs, and that is one of the major issues in Palau because Palau's soil is very vulnerable to erosion because it's red soil and limestone. So those types of sediment are very easily washed down when there is no trees or vegetation holding that in the ground. And with recent new housing for those that lived on the coast and their homes were destroyed by either sea level rise or typhoons, they are now moving up more into inland for new housing. And that's also creating more sedimentation into the coral reefs. And it's not just the coral reefs, but also the seagrass, the mangroves. They're also being impacted by this.
Now, speaking of sedimentation, I do know taro patches are common in Palau because it's part of your tradition to pass them down to the next generations. Now, for our listeners, these are rectangular fields of taro root crops with irrigation channels built into them. There's a study published in the Wetlands Ecology and Management Journal that says taro patches can help reduce sedimentation that goes into the sea. Could you tell us more about this?
Yes, that's correct. So taro patches are sort of like the first filters of sort of runoff into the ocean, and then it's the mangroves. So the taro patch and the mangroves are also very important to help filter the water that goes into the coral reefs.
And forests.
Oh yes, and forest, the watershed.
Fascinating. So the point is that there are solutions to these threats that in fact already come naturally to Palauans. Now I can see why Palau is called a conservation nation. You come up with all of these initiatives to protect the environment, and you are well known for embedding conservation in your way of life. Now, something very specific to your country, for example, this tradition of bull. Tell us about this. Tell us about this tradition of bull.
Bull is the Palauan term for conservation. It's always under the authority of like traditional leaders. We've always been conservative people, and we've always understood that resources are limited. And the practice of bull, which is like conserving something, is a traditional practice where if the leaders noticed that like important resources were depleting, like fish in the coral reef, then they would tell the people in the community not to fish in that area anymore until it's safe again, or until they repopulate it. Replenish, yes. People would just fish what's enough for their household and enough to bring to their relatives.
With the traditional conservation methods, they made the way for us for our modern management strategies. So, for example, the Palau National Marine Sanctuary came from the idea of bull. The Palau National Marine Sanctuary is the production of 80% of Palau's EEZ waters.
80%. So no one is allowed to fish or extract natural resources in 80% of those waters. The good thing, of course, I would presume, is that the exploited reef fish population are allowed, are able to replenish.
The Palau National Marine Sanctuary Act is sort of helping push the fishers to more of the fishing for pelagics, giving them another opportunity to release pressure from the reef fish.
Pelagic fish are those found in the open ocean, far from the shore, like tuna, marlin, swordfish, Spanish mackerel. They are much less endangered than the reef fish that fishers love to catch, yes? And actually, apart from the ones we mentioned, Palauan fishers also practice responsible fishing on their own. For example, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO, notes that these guys catch adult fish as opposed to juvenile ones. They avoid the use of small mesh nets. They stop fishing activities during spawning periods, and they work with NGOs to protect coral reefs. All of this is really fascinating. Perhaps you have stories of this on the ground?
There was a sand mining project that was about to take place in Elchung State in Palau, and after Ebiil Society and EQPB,
Environmental Quality Protection Board,
and EQPB did their research, they figured out that that place was actually home to endangered species like dugongs. So they worked together with the community, and then they said no to that project.
I think for Palau to be a small island and already doing these big initiatives like 80% of the EEZ being protected and a sanctuary, that can help, I guess, larger countries to wake up and become more active in what they're saying and what are the strategies that they're coming up with. We need to be able to make sure that there is resources for our future generations, and that's part of what we've learned from our culture too. Like, it's not just our resources, it's for the future.
Also, I just want to say that, like, in camp and in our research programs, when we learned about those things, like, we'd learn both the scientific and the indigenous aspect of a knowledge being taught to us. So for her, she's talking about the scientific part of it, but then while we're learning the scientific aspect of conservation, they're also teaching us the Palauan proverbs and the Palauan oral histories and stories about conservation, so that we understand, as we grow up, we understand that conservation is important. Okay, so one example is, I'm going to say it in Palauan, Akluko Karkamay, which means tomorrow is still to come. So whatever you're doing, be conservative, because you're still waiting for tomorrow. And another one is Ndalmi Akalala Kluko, which in my best attempt to translate it means you have to plant for tomorrow, which does not necessarily just mean plants. It means like
you leave some resources for the next day or the next generation. It's sort of like, it's not take all now, just take what you need and leave the rest for another time.
Be sure to catch the rest of this conversation by searching for Climate-smart Fisheries on your favorite podcast app. Climate-smart Fisheries is brought to you by RARE, a conservation NGO that supports local governments, national agencies, and communities in promoting climate resilience in coastal fisheries management. It was part of RARE's Fishing for Climate Resilience project, supported by Germany's Federal Ministry for the Environment, Natural Conservation, and Nuclear Safety through the International Climate Initiative. The Palau episode was hosted by Robbie Alampay, produced by Macy Hoven, with Rare Philippines' Yasmin Akiza and Angel Uzon, and Rare Palau's Kevin Mesibelu. The audio editor was Nico Bolante. Thanks for listening to Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Carl Sayat, Puma Podcast. Today's episode was produced by Marco Azurin and put together by Freddy Blanco. Maraming salamat po.